Thank you very much. It's an honor to introduce Tim O'Reilly. My name's Pete Binfield, and I'm the co-founder of PeerJ, a new open access publisher that probably many of you have heard of. What you may not know is that Tim O'Reilly, who I'm sure you have heard of, is also one of the main backers behind PeerJ, in the shape of O'Reilly Media and his seed investment company, OATV. Although Tim hasn't historically been part of the STM journal industry, he's always been a great advocate for all things open, and so it was a great honor for him to be involved in PeerJ with us. In his career, Tim has been the founder and CEO of O'Reilly Media. He's organized the Tools of Change conferences, which probably many of you have attended, and he hosts events such as SciFu, which is held in collaboration with Nature and Google. It's coming up in a couple of weeks. He's helped to define terms such as open source and Web 2.0, and he's currently very active in the Maker community. The central theme which runs through all of Tim's interactions is to advocate for open source, open standards, and sensible intellectual property laws. Most recently, he's turned his attention to matters of open government and the public service organization Code for America. And in February 2012, he joined the advisory board of UC Berkeley's School of Information. I can tell you from my own interactions with Tim that he's truly engaged and deeply interested in the challenges that our industry is facing today. He takes an active interest in developments in the scholarly publishing world, and he's always got something insightful to contribute. I'm sure you're going to enjoy this keynote immensely. So please welcome me in, or join me in welcoming Tim to open the 2013 meeting of the Society for Scholarly Publishing as the conference considers its theme of surviving and thriving in our multi-access world. Thank you.
Hi there, thanks for coming. I like to open my talks with a quote because, as Oscar Wilde once said, quotation is a serviceable substitute for wit. Unfortunately, I have to invoke another Oscar Wilde quote before I get started, and that is the one where he said, only the mediocre man is always at his best. Because I am under the influence of a bad flu, and so I'm going to be somewhat lower energy level than usual, and I hope you will forgive me. But the quote I wanted to start with is not the Oscar Wilde quote, but really this quote that inspired my title, Living in Today's World. It's a quote from William Gibson, the science fiction writer, who said, "The future is here, it's just not evenly distributed yet." And it's really important for all of us in publishing, and scholarly publishing, as well as commercial publishers, to think about the future and what's happening. And so I'm going to start by talking about some things from the consumer internet that talk to me about the shape of information products and how information is changing the way we live. And then I'm going to talk very specifically about some things in my publishing business and potentially in yours that are really kind of along the path, but unfortunately not as far as I'd like. So let me start with an application called Square. How many people know about Square? Right. Oh, a lot of you. Okay, so this is Jack Dorsey of Twitter, his second company. Clever little dongle. You know, it's a little hardware hack that I'll turn the audio port on a phone into a credit card reader. But what's really interesting was when Jack introduced the second part of the play, which was an application called Square Reader. Square Register, rather, which is the cash register application. And if you've ever gone into a coffee shop equipped with this combo, the smartphone app and the iPad cash register, you can have this transformative experience where you walk in and they say, "You're Tim O'Reilly." And if I shop there regularly, they might even say, "Do you want your usual?" You don't have to pay. Or, well, you do have to pay, but you don't have to take out your wallet. You take out this thing. You take out neither your phone nor your wallet, because if you're running the app is broadcasting to the cash register that you're in the store, and so your face has shown up on the cash register. and your credit card information is already on file with Square, and so therefore, bingo, you walk out with your drink without paying, or without appearing to pay, let's put it that way. So here are some of the lessons that I take from this application. One, it's software above the level of a single device. Now, I think a lot of us in our thinking about electronic publishing are still thinking about maybe the web on the screen of our desktop PC or maybe our laptop. But it's really important to understand that applications like this are living on the internet, and they may have multiple touch points. And that framing concept should be deep into everything you think about. There are a lot of people who are saying, oh, think mobile first. And I don't think it's necessarily mobile first. It's really understanding that we're building systems in which mobile devices are part of something much larger. The second lesson is that sensors transform the experience. Your phone is a sensor package. There's applications, for example, for fitness. And I remember, even though I'm an investor in Runkeeper, I remember I used to be really frustrated. I go, why do I have to tell it that I started running? The phone knows when I'm walking and when I'm running. It knows when I stop. And they've actually updated the app since then to do that. But I think for a lot of even pretty hip application developers, we're just starting to understand what kind of context can be provided by the phone. And I think Square has done a great job of saying, oh, wait, you don't have to check in. You don't even have to take your phone out of your pocket. If the app is running, it can talk to the cash register without any intervention. The third lesson here is data. There's data in the background. There's also network effects in the data. The more customers that Square has, the more services that the application can provide. It has your credit card, it has your face, it has a lot of information, and I think there's going to be a lot more in there. The fourth is that when you have all these things, software above the level of a single device, data, sensors, you're actually able to rethink workflows in a fundamental way and change the experience of a customer. And you really see this idea also in the Apple Store. How different is that Apple Store where the clerks are equipped with smartphones instead of cash registers? And you walk in and you say, I want one of those, and somebody brings it out from the back room, hands it to you, they put a sticker on it, and you walk out. And if you have an Apple ID, you just sign out. Again, same thing, your credit card's on file, you're kind of done. But Apple went and they used the new technology to rethink the workflow of retail in the same way that Square is doing. I think that's really the significance of something like Google Glass. It's a tool that will allow us to rethink the workflow of many kinds of professional applications, bringing information into context, where you could start imagining somebody in a particular context just being able to glance up and get without even that smartphone, being able to look up and say, oh, here's what I need, here's how to enable this next step. And you can see that where Google is going with this, with Google Now, they're moving from information retrieval to an information fabric where they're suggesting things constantly to you that may be relevant, that you may want to know about. And that brings me to lesson 5 from these apps, which is that they're a way of closing the loop. I got this line from Chris Sacca, who was used to be head of special projects at Google. And he was describing his investment philosophy to me. He said, what I learned from Google is to only invest in things that close the loop. Now, when you think about that, Google itself is this huge engine for figuring out in real time better and better what people are actually looking for. They do think, there was the original insight of PageRank, which was a kind of citation, which of course something we're all familiar with in scholarly publishing. But they figured out how to leverage it electronically. They figured out that there was authority on the web, which didn't appear to have any. But then they started figuring out other ways to close the loop. they started noticing the difference between what they call a long click and a short click. A short click means that you went to a search result and it wasn't what you wanted, you came right back to the search page. A long click meant you went there, you spent some time there. And they took that and they said, wow, that's definitely meaningful. So something that gets lots of short clicks starts migrating down isn't meaningful. So that's what Chris meant by closing the loop. Now, one of his investments is in a company called Uber. How many of you ever tried Uber? Okay, fewer of you that know about Square. Uber is astonishing. If you're in a city that has it, how much it changes your experience of using, effectively a taxi. You're calling up a black car or a taxi with this app. Again, software above the level of a single device. There's a phone in your hand. There's a phone in the driver's hand. There's this cloud application in between. And it's closing the loop. It says, your driver Ahmed is 3 minutes away. And you actually can look in the map on the app and you see the progress of his car towards you. He texts you when he's arriving. So it has data stored in there about you. It's also got ratings in there, which is really interesting. Question that's raised for me is, can user ratings start to replace regulation? You have great service, and if you give somebody 1 or 2 stars, they get enough of those, they're out of the service. So there's some really interesting things here. But great example of closing the loop and of using the sensors. We know where you are, we know where the driver is, using communications. Anyway, great example of what's happening out there and putting these principles to work. But if you take just an experience from a scholarly world, I was thinking about how that closing the loop principle might be applied to a poster session at a conference. I was at the American Geophysical Union conference at Moscone Center, which had something like 20,000 people, and basically football field-sized poster session. And at the time I was there, most of the posters had nobody, standing there to explain them. It was kind of a ghost town. And you thought, wow, what could you do to enrich that experience so that people could connect with the people, say, hey, I'm interested in this, where are you? There's people here. There's a lot you could do with sensors, with data, to totally transform that experience, because of course people want to know who did the work. They may want to talk to them, they may have questions. There's a great opportunity to take some of those principles and fix something like that. So, that kind of leaves me with that question of, what should we as publishers be doing with data to enrich our current businesses or to build entirely new businesses? And that kind of leads me a little bit sideways to the question of open data, particularly in scientific research. We know the great disaster recently of Reinhardt and Rogoff, where they had bad error in their formula. The fact that it was possible for somebody to recreate the research, really mattered. To say, okay, they made an error in their spreadsheet. This was wrong. And I think we have to get better. That's why I'm a big fan of the Panton principles, the idea that scientific papers should be associated with the data. The data should be published, not just the result, the description of the research. There's some also amazing things that can be done, even in the humanities, with open data. I heard actually about this particular piece of research in an NPR story, although I went and read the paper, about somebody doing word frequency analysis on Agatha Christie and kind of tracing the change in her vocabulary as she got older. And there's a very sad moment. The author comes to the conclusion that she was suffering from Alzheimer's, and that at this particular point in her work, her word usage became very, very different. She started to use much more generic words, much smaller vocabulary. This is something like her 86th book. I forget exactly what number it is, but quite late in her work. And I still remember hearing the author on the radio saying, until I did this analysis, I thought of this simply as a bad book. And once I'd done the analysis, I realized what a brave book it was. It's about a detective who's losing her memory. And so she knew what was happening. She kept going, but she knew that something was happening to her mind. And it's just so wonderful what you can detect when you actually have computers to work on a body of data. So, I think so many of us as publishers are focused on a set of artifacts that we have created. And I would just really urge us to think a little bit more deeply about what we could do with the underlying data and processes. This is clearly a big focus. We see the National Science Foundation is looking at big data in science. And I have to say, companies like Macmillan with digital science are doing a great job starting to say, well, what else can we do besides just the publishing? And I've worked with the team at Nature on our science FUCAMP, and I love where they've gone here. They've basically thought much more broadly. And there are other companies. This is one of our investments at OATV. In addition to PeerJ, is something called Science Exchange, which is a scientific services marketplace, a data-driven services play. But there are other questions. In a lot of ways, isn't impact factor really a way of closing the loop about what papers worked, what mattered? How would we reinvent that in this digital age? We should be asking that question. But I want to move on in my exploration of interesting, provocative technologies and to talk about the Google autonomous vehicle. Now, this is kind of interesting because it looks to you like a triumph of artificial intelligence. But the real lesson to me in this vehicle is that it's actually an example of this principle that I talked about back when I first defined the term Web 2.0 back in 2005 by saying that Web 2.0 was about using the internet as a platform to harness collective intelligence. I made the argument that Google, Amazon, eBay, all these guys who survived the dot-com bust versus, say, Pets.com that didn't, they were all companies that had figured out in their own unique way how to use the network to capture the intelligence and the activity of people in new ways. But you think, this self-driving car? How's that an example of that? But here's the thing. In 2005, the winner of the DARPA Grand Challenge went 7 miles in 7 hours. So 6 years later, Google says we have a car that's driven hundreds of thousands of miles in ordinary traffic. What was the difference? Well, Peter Norvig, Google's chief scientist, said, we don't have better algorithms, we just have more data. But what was really interesting was what kind of data? Turns out that it was those infamous Google Street View cars, those things that were privacy-violating, troublemaking vehicles. That is, there were people who were equipped with sensors, who were driving every road and uploading the memory of their trip into the global brain. Those cars were measuring to millimeter accuracy the path that those cars took down the road. So what's really happening with that Google automated vehicle is it's actually remembering what some human driver did in a previous period, because it can say exactly where it is. And as Peter said to me, he said, picking out a traffic light out of the field of view of a camera is a fairly hard AI problem, but figuring out if it's red or green when you already know it's there is relatively trivial. So this idea of human-computer symbiosis, I think, is a really central idea in all of the great companies of the web. And I think we have to actually understand it in our own business, because, of course, human cooperation is at the heart of scholarly work. We are fundamentally all about gathering, collecting, harvesting human knowledge. And it's sort of interesting to think that, wow, we used to do it by capturing words, putting them on paper, this incredible gift of what Alfred Korzybski called time binding, the ability to take knowledge and put it down on paper and transmit it to someone at a remote time and space, was this incredible technological vision. But we're increasingly taking it in deeper directions. And J.C.R. Licklider, who was the DARPA program manager who funded the internet originally, wrote a paper back in 1960 called Man-Computer Symbiosis. He said the hope is that in not too many years, human brains and computing machines will be coupled together very tightly, and the resulting partnership will think as no human brain has ever thought, and process data in a way not approached by the information handling machines we know today. So I think it's really important to think about that as well as everything else as context. So, because where that leads me is to this whole concept of peer production. Because it doesn't have to be this sort of magic bit of what appears to be AI. It might simply be a better way of having people work together. And so if you look at Yochai Benkler's paper from 2001 called Coase's Penguin, or Linux and the Nature of the Firm, he said, I expand consideration of the policy implications of the apparent success of free software in two ways. First, I suggest that the phenomena has broad implications throughout the information, knowledge, and culture economy, well beyond software development. Second, I suggest reasons to think that peer production may outperform market-based production in some information production activities. So that turned out to be true in software, that Linux and Apache and MySQL and so forth became the foundation for the web. We have this method of open, shared creation of infrastructure. So that is itself a kind of man-computer symbiosis. We've used this network to build the network. We've used this network to connect ourselves in new ways, to find new possibilities of connection. And this has several aspects. The first of them is something that Clay Shirky has said, and you guys have probably heard, which is the notion of filter then publish is giving way to publish then filter. So you see that really in the incredible what you call Schumpeterian waste of free software development, where there's thousands and thousands and thousands of free software programs that are put out that nobody uses. And then some of them are discovered, become important, get built on, build a community. Sounds a little bit like the process of science or literary scholarship. There's that paper that nobody read, and then there's that paper that changed the way everybody thought. So, we've always had a vein of that. I think the internet has just helped us to get better at it. And of course, I can't help giving a plug to PeerJ here as a wonderful example of an open access publication putting that to work. But I was sort of struck by the similarity on PLOS One's peer review statement and Clay's 2003 formulation. It says, PLOS One will rigorously peer review your submissions and publish all papers that are judged to be technically sound. Judgments about the importance of any particular paper are then made after publication by the readership, who are most qualified to determine what is of interest to them. So PLOS One and the open access movement, I think, has really embraced this notion of that we've seen elsewhere on the internet of publish first, then filter. The next principle, which is also related to that, was formulated by Eric Raymond in his book *The Cathedral and the Bazaar* as given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. That is, distributed peer review actually works better than picking a few experts. I think we've demonstrated in the software world that that's true, and I think it also has a lot of relevance in scholarly publishing as well. But there's another aspect to open source software that I really want to emphasize. And this is kind of a little self-referential here. This is a quote from Wikipedia, but I wrote it. It's talking about the Unix programming environment. It says, this book is perhaps most valuable for the exposition of the Unix philosophy of small cooperating tools with standardized inputs and outputs, a philosophy that also shaped the end-to-end philosophy of the internet. It is this philosophy and the architecture based on it that has allowed open source projects to be assembled into larger systems such as Linux without explicit coordination between developers. I think it's really, really important. It's not just about being open. It's about how do you design a system so that it enables participation. Thank you. And I think that's an important lesson for us to think about in publishing. Are the units with which we're working, are the systems with which we're working the right ones to get the kind of virtuous circles that we see in many kind of internet applications? The reason, the point I was trying to make about Unix was that it was designed in such a way that anybody could write an independent program that simply worked because it talked the same language. Same reason the internet was designed. Very simple protocol. If you spoke the protocol, you belonged. And I remember talking with Linus Torvalds of Linux, and he said, I couldn't have built Linux, a new Linux kernel, equivalent of a Linux kernel for Windows, even if I'd had the source code. It wasn't about being open. He said the architecture wouldn't have permitted it because everything was sort of glommed together, versus Unix, small kernel, a lot of extensible programs that just were designed to speak the same language. And so I think that architecture of participation is a key idea. And there's a related idea also, which has really gotten a lot of currency lately in the startup community through a guy named Eric Ries, who wrote a wonderful book called The Lean Startup. And it's not about doing startups that are cheap. It's actually doing experiments that are cheap. He said that the minimum viable product, which is what he urges you to do, is that version of a new product which allows a team to collect the maximum amount of validated learning about customers with the least effort. And he tells this story about a startup he was part of that built this very complicated 3D avatar chat instant messaging system that supported all of the 12 most popular instant messaging systems, and it flopped. And he said, when we were doing the retrospective afterwards, he said, we asked ourselves, would we have learned as much if we'd only supported the top 3? He said, sure. And he said, but the more we thought about it, we realized we would have learned enough if we'd only put up a web page offering the product, because we would have discovered that nobody wanted it. And so it's a wonderful idea of what is the minimum viable product, because so many of those open source modules are just little pieces. It's just that they add up over time. And that, of course, is also at the heart of something like Wikipedia. I love showing this. You remember the Sendai earthquake in 2011 in Japan. This was the first version of the Wikipedia page. Written in broken English, an earthquake occurred on 30 kilometers east of Sendai, Honshu, Japan. The earthquake possible to create regional tsunami on the zone. Minimum viable product. It happened within a minute or two after the earthquake, somebody created that stub article. And then, over the next period of weeks, as the story developed, you can see through the efforts of thousands of volunteers, that page evolved. People contributed, they argued, they changed things, and ended up with a full-featured page. So Michael Nielsen, by the way, how many here in this people in this audience have read this book, Reinventing Discovery? This is probably the best book you could read on lessons from the internet for scholarly publishers. Even though it's focused on science, it's really teases apart some of the key ideas that Michael Nielsen, Reinventing Discovery. But he says Wikipedia is not an encyclopedia. It's a virtual city, a city whose main export to the world is its encyclopedia articles, but with an internal life of its own. So if you look at this, every Wikipedia article has a talk page where people can argue. So people have this idea that, Wikipedia, wow, we would be better to have a peer-reviewed encyclopedia with experts. No, people argue, and this is interesting. This page, for example, they call it the Tohoku earthquake, not the Sendai earthquake. Why? Well, because there was a debate, and they said, let's call it what the people in Japan call it. And it's maybe the right thing to do. The other thing that's so critical to Wikipedia, and I don't think we've seen enough uptake of this in publishing, is revision control. The big safety net that Wikipedia has is that you can revert. You can see the changes. You can go backwards. The reason I was able to do that animation is because every single version of that page still exists. And I think there's a great opportunity for publishers to engage with that process. So when Wikipedia was rethinking the job of the encyclopedia, they said, let's publish first, then filter and improve. They added revision control so we can see who did what and revert if needed, and there's conversation and community. Well, what do you think? Preprints, publish, then filter. What do you think? Scholarly societies, conversation and community. I don't think there's anything terribly inconsistent here with scholarly publishing as we know it. We just have to actually say, okay, well, what could we do to take these core principles of the intellectual enterprise and rethink them online. So I want to switch a little bit to another peer-produced area. This is video. I became familiar through my grandson, who's now 4, but this is it was his thing when he was 3, was Thomas the Tank Engine train crash videos. This is one made by a 5-year-old and his dad, which I think had 24 million views at the time I took the screenshot. And, it's kind of interesting. That's peer production, at its best. When a 5-year-old can create something that is watched it was watched 24 million times. But again, you see the same kind of thing. A YouTube video, minimum viable product, a small unit of participation, a platform that enables people to put stuff up. There are videos that get 1 or 2 views, and there are videos that get millions. It's publish first, then filter. So I think that there are some real lessons here again. And, we're struggling at O'Reilly to figure out how do we bring that into our business. We have not cracked the code yet, but I think it's important. I want to just unpack video a minute because it was one of my biggest wake-up calls last year as I went to this conference called VidCon, which is sort of a YouTube creators fan conference. Had about 8,000 or 9,000 people there. Most of them were teenage girls. And the keynote was 2 hours of YouTube stars coming out on stage doing their shtick for 5 minutes, right? Each 5 minutes, right? And it felt like being at a Beatles concert in 1964. I mean, thousands of screaming girls. And there was this one kid, Charlie McDonald, that was his line waiting for autographs. It looked like that for 6 hours. After the keynote's finished at, 10, he was there signing autographs, and it looked like that. I took a picture much like that, and when I left at 4 o'clock, the line was just as long. So, there's something happening there, a cultural phenomenon. Now, obviously you go, well, what does this have to do with scholarly publishing? Not much, except that it really demonstrates how video is becoming such a first-class communication object, and we as publishers all have to take it very, very seriously. Google has actually figured out how to monetize even this, consumer video. You probably can't read it, but this is somebody's wedding dance video, and it's got something like 80 million views. But Google is offering to sell CDs of the song. So somebody put the song there. Google also will run advertising against it. Doesn't give the money to the person who posted the wedding video. They give it to the artist whose music is being used. So it's turned out to have actually a very powerful economic model. And one of the scuttlebutt stories I heard, I can't mention the name of the major pop star, but I heard that a major pop star actually makes more money on YouTube than on iTunes, and makes most of that money from fan uploaded clips that use her music. So the point I would make there is, when you're thinking about economic models for content, there are other kinds of models that go with this sort of crazy crowdsourced world out there, and don't just dismiss them. Now, obviously, in scholarly publishing, you say, well, we're never going to have something that has 80 million views. Sure. But, I would point to, here's 102 million views for the channel of the guy who does minute physics. There are people who are interested in topics like this. Could you use that as part of a bigger funnel? And in fact, he's getting interesting ad revenue. When I went to take that screenshot, I first had to watch an ad for a Dell computer, a little video clip. So, and of course, this TED, which is popularizing, absolutely, but incredible opportunity to share intellectual work product with a huge audience around the world. And even apart from that, look at something like lynda.com, which is, in my world, business is now somewhere between $70 and $100 million in subscription revenue for video training. So I would just urge you, leaving everything else aside, take video very seriously, but also take small units of video very seriously. So anyway, what does all this have to do with publishing? I've kind of gone on a bit of a tour through some apps that are really, really far out, and then coming to some things that seem to have a little bit more to do with publishing. But what I want to do here is to just give you some context. Edmund Schlossberg once said the skill of writing is to create a context in which other people can think. And so I've been trying to frame some technology themes, to put them in the back of your mind, so that when you start asking the question, what job does a book do, you'll actually be a little more open-minded about thinking about how you answer that question. So again, thinking of my grandson, if he were, if it were me 50 years ago, I might have, read Beatrix Potter. He plays Angry Birds. And, you have to realize, oh, wait, an ebook version of Beatrix Potter is not going to cut it, when, here's this very engaging game, and actually very educational game. I've become very, very impressed. For example, one of the Rovio games, Bad Piggies, you have to actually construct a things like a little working airplane. If you put the parts in the wrong order, it falls over. Kids are learning physics just by doing stuff. And watching this little 4-year-old, mucking with this stuff and figuring out the rules of this arbitrary universe, it's hard to say this is not actually pretty darn educational. I have a 10-year-old stepdaughter who has that same experience with Minecraft. And of course, even in the more wasteful games, I was really struck by this, the imagery, this science fiction book from the 70s or 80s, Larry Niven's Protector, and the kind of creature that was being used on this halo, very similar. Just reminding us that, entertainment is entertainment, and the job that was done by Larry Niven's Protector may be now being done for somebody who would once have been a reader by Halo. But this is the one I really want, to leave you with, that connects the dots between the earlier, part of the talk where I was talking about Square and Uber and rethinking workflows and so on. This is the ultimate rethinking of the workflow, because that Google autonomous vehicle used to be a book. That used to be a book. You had images on paper that told you where to go. And yeah, sure, it's usually a map, but then, sometimes we had it in actually the form factor of a book, like a Rand McNally Road Atlas. And think about the evolution of that. So the first stage was where we said, okay, great, we can put it online. And then you had, online maps. But they were not that dissimilar from paper maps. And it was like, oh, when Google Maps came out in 2005, look, it's whizzy. You can stretch it and you can move it around and pan it around, and it's interactive. And we got more data layers. And then it got on our phones and it became context sensitive. It knew where you were, and there's that blue dot on Google Maps, as you walk down the street, following you, as you drive. How awesome is that? So GPS and all this kind of stuff. But the end game, the map completely disappears. And you say to the car, potentially say to the car, take me, to Joe's place. Take me to, the supermarket. And the car knows. The data has been internalized. The map is no longer something that's presented to you as a user. So that's what I mean about using this new technology to rethink workflows. This is, probably the ultimate example of how that has happened to a particular class of document or book. And I think that's what we really have to think about as publishers. So, I asked, Pete what, he thought the jobs of scholarly publishers were, and he pointed me to a slide called the 4 functions of a scholarly journal, which pointed out archiving, registration, dissemination, and certification. I made a small tweak to the last bullet, which said assessing contributions and giving stamps of approval, not only to research, but also to researchers. Because, of course, it's really important to remember that it's not just about the content, it's about the people who produce the content. And any of you who obviously run scholarly societies, and not just scholarly publishers, know that. But I think this is a thread all through the current internet era. It's about social. Well, guess what? Since the very earliest scholarly societies, it's been about social. So let's not give up that ground. Let's say, how do we reinvent our own products to be more social? So let me give you now a real quick tour of some of the things we're doing at O'Reilly. First off, we were originally a book publisher, and then we started adding conferences. And at some point, I reframed the story of the company. And I said, what do we really do? I read that book, Built to Last, which you may remember, Jim Collins and Jerry Porras, that book about the characteristics of great companies. He says they have big, hairy, audacious goals. And I wrote down in the margin of my book, changing the world by spreading the knowledge of innovators. That's what we really did. And so we redrew the map of the company. And so we put that in the center. That's what we do. And we said, yeah, we do publishing, we do video, we do events, yeah, we do research, we do training, we do venture capital. Because these are all things that contribute to that mission. We might find somebody and we say, wow, you've got great knowledge, write a book. You've got great knowledge, stand up on stage and share it with someone. You've got great knowledge, let's fund you to make a company. And then we've organized our company around what we call practice areas. So we have, you may notice, we have a Strata conference, which is all about data. We have something else called Velocity for web operations. We have a whole series of conferences for developers. And so we really think about these as practice areas and try to focus not just on books, but what can we do for that audience? And then we've tried to integrate those things. So, and we ask ourselves, what jobs do we do? Well, we teach, we provide reference material, we help people connect with their peers. For the authors and conference presenters, our goal is to build reputation, maybe give them access to capital. And so when you go to like an O'Reilly page, like data.o'reilly.com, you'll see this whole set of things. We've got books, we've got conferences, we've got white papers and newsletters and so on. And we're really trying to build community. We're still at the early stages of figuring that out. But it seems to me that where we're ending up in our business looks a lot like where scholarly societies are starting. This combination of events, in person, community, publishing, all working together. And so I think that's kind of an interesting thing. And it's working quite well for us relative to our competition. So we're starting to increasingly build a direct relationship with our customers. Most publishers have kind of for years, avoided having a direct relationship with customers. They sell through retailers. Scholarly publishers, I think, are an exception. That's a real asset. If you're a New York publisher and all you ever sold through was Barnes & Noble and, Borders, well, they're gone, and Amazon, you're really toast. Well, I have the pleasure of being probably the only publisher who can say for ebooks that Amazon is my third largest distribution outlet. The first is my own site, O'Reilly.com. The second is Safari Books Online, my subscription service. And in third place, Amazon. That's because we focused on that, building that direct relationship, and we're really focused now through our practice area strategy on building that community, building those direct relationships. And I think, when I look around at businesses that I go, wow, I'd like to actually work with, to kind of take that idea and learn from, but also to update. It's scholarly societies. I was talking with some guy I spoke a couple of years ago at the Silverchair Strategies Conference, and there's some guy in the elevator, and I said, oh, who do you work for? And it was like the Society of Optoelectronics Engineers, and I said, how many members do you have? And he's like, 80,000. Yeah, that's an amazing base for a business. How do we, start taking that and figuring out what kinds of new services you can provide for those customers by saying, what job do we do? We don't just provide, publishing. We don't just provide an annual conference. Let's go start working that, figure out what we can do for this incredible customer base we have. So the other thing, we really figured out this sort of sweet spot with video as well. We shoot all of our conferences. We actually have something we call an all-access pass. I don't know how many tracks this conference has, but one of the experiences that our attendees have at our conferences is they can't see everything. And for a 20% upsell, we give them access to everything, because it's all captured on video. They can basically go, and we find about 25% of our customers will pay us an extra $400 or $500 to be able to have access to the video after the fact. We also then are able to sell it on our Safari subscription service. So, there's this sort of really interesting, virtuous circle between, the conferences and the video publishing. We've also been working with some of our corporate customers. This is something we're working on with Etsy, which has internal training for their staff, and we're actually helping them to turn it into video training, and then they're letting us sell it to the public. We're also looking at the whole area of interactive, online learning. So, for example, we're through our venture firm, O'Reilly Alphatech Ventures, we're an investor in Code Academy, which, for example, teaches, has online JavaScript training. We have our books, but we also have we're building an experimental publishing environment, which we're going to be rolling out later this year, where you can actually build all of this kind of interactivity right into our books as well. And we're pretty excited about that. The other thing that's really interesting in this Atlas publishing environment is we really built in commenting and community. We've built a fairly robust early access program, and that's something that's really unusual and unexpected, is that when we publish books early access, that is, we say, okay, usually we found that when we publish them too early, that was a problem. We literally sell people books when they're 25% done. When we sold them when they were 10% done, people would say, I feel ripped off. But 25% is enough there. They can start watching the book as it continues to grow. But what's really interesting is when those books show up in Safari, our subscription service, the books that were available early access as a category significantly outperform all books that were not available early access. They build early buzz. They get people interested. For whatever reason, there's just much more traffic in them. So we're taking a leaf from Wikipedia with Atlas. We have sort of inline commenting and community. Anybody who's an author can invite in reviewers. It's also a great way to interact with, say, the production editors or illustrators or whatever. I think it's a very, very powerful environment, and we are, in fact, going to be making it available to other publishers. But it's also backed by GitHub. How many people here know about GitHub? Okay, GitHub is something that's taken the world of software development by storm. Remember how I talked about version control in Wikipedia? The version control is something that all software developers use now. And the most popular version control system in the open source world is something called Git, which was written by none other than Linus Torvalds, who also created Linux. And GitHub is a place where it's a public repository where anybody can share their code. And it provides a robust backend for version control, and we use it for our books. So, for example, here you can see in this particular page what was taken, what was added, what was changed, and that allows you for that ability to revert, to take comments, to potentially allow multiple editors, multiple authors to work on the same manuscript at the same time. But this is what keeps me up at night. This is what keeps me up at night. I feel like the things that we're doing, they're kind of cool, and they're kind of like Google Maps in 2005. They're not like the Google self-driving car in 2011. And so, and to be sure, the Google car is still a concept car. We're not driving them around yet. So we have some time. But I want you to keep that in mind. You know, the future is here. It's just not evenly distributed yet. These systems that will totally remake the workflows of our world, in the way that Square remakes retail, or the way that the Google autonomous vehicle could remake driving, or the way Uber remakes the experience of getting a taxi, are going to affect the things that we do as well. How will sensors, big data, community, the ability to connect people online, to close the loop in new ways, how will all these things change the fundamental activities that we're engaged in, that is, of disseminating knowledge, of helping people to figure out effectively how to get from here to there? Because that ultimately is the business we're in, just as Rand McNally was. If you're, a biblical scholar, you want to get from here to there just as much as if you are a technologist looking for the latest technology, or somebody trying to hit the road. So, and I'm going to leave you with a final quote, this one from Ray Kurzweil, who said, "I'm an inventor, and I realized that an invention, I became interested in trends because an invention has to make sense in the world in which it is finished, not the world in which it is started." We're in a period of immense transformation of how knowledge is gathered, built, disseminated in our culture, and we as publishers play a huge and unique role in that culture, and we should take seriously the inventive requirements that are upon us to reinvent ourselves, to reinvent the future of scholarly communications. Thank you very much. So I think we have time for Q&A. Is that correct? Okay. So anybody wants to ask me anything, I'm happy to do that. And if not, I'm happy to have you go for. All right. Let's start over here. Yeah, go to the mic. You probably, if there's more than one or two of you, go line up at the mics. Yeah.
Yeah. Hi. Thanks very much. Yeah, you kind of blew my mind during this session and gave me new perspectives. I work for Institutional Investor, a publishing company, and we're very concerned, about copyright agreements. We're looking into open access, things like that. So when you were talking about making content available first, publish first, of course, we're concerned about well, this is content that could be distributed, without, resulting in any, revenue for us,
Yeah.
which is, gotten by subscribers. So, I'm kind of thinking that we're trying to hold on to an old model.
Yeah.
And we're losing, the battle in certain sense.
Well, here's how I think about that. First off, I'm not dogmatic about it. I think that, Stuart Brand said information wants to be free, but people forget the other half of what he said, which is that information also wants to be valuable. And there are different ways for it to become valuable. And I do think that there's a class of people who figured out how to make their information more valuable by giving it away for nothing. That's the example. I actually wrote a little editorial for Nature probably 6 or 7 years ago where I talked about Bill Gates and Larry Wall, the creator of the Perl programming language. I said, look, Larry realized he's not an entrepreneur. He can't make any money selling his software. He's gotten a lot of great stuff for nothing himself. So why not give it away? He wanted to maximize his impact. So it was very successful, to give his software away. It actually achieved his objectives. Bill Gates figured out how to make a boatload of money by not giving it away. So there's, more than one way to do it, and you pick the hat to fit the head. And at O'Reilly, we've done a bunch of experiments, and what we have found for our kind of content is that we actually have gained more by, we sell stuff, we don't give it away, but we give it away DRM free, or we sell it DRM free, and that's actually given us access to, much bigger markets. We sell ebooks in countries where we've never sold a print book. More than half of our ebook sales are from outside the U.S. Versus I think 20% of we never got above 25% of our print books sold outside the U.S. We have actually also experimented with free publishing licenses where people could take the books and fork them. Most people, in the days of print, most people were happy to buy. So you would often we'd often sell. We'd have somebody download 40, 50,000 copies, but we'd sell more copies than we'd sell of a comparable book that wasn't available for free, because a good number of those people who were downloading the free version weren't going to pay us anyway. We also figured out other ways to do it. For example, I mentioned this Perl programming language where we had the dominant book. It turns out that the authors of the language, the Perl programming language, were also the authors of our book, and they put a lot of the same text into the help files for the language. And we encouraged that, we allowed them to do it. But the format was sufficiently different, and the added value of the book was sufficiently great that it all worked out. So I think there's a lot of different ways to do that. But I do think that we've been very successful with the DRM-free ebooks. We think that at the very least, don't worry so much about that. We actually heard that we took on. I probably shouldn't say this. I may be speaking out of school, so I won't say it. But we're doing very. Let me put it this way: we actually have a digital distribution business where we distribute other technical publishers, and we're doing very well for some of them. So,
thanks very much.
Yeah. So be courageous, but do things, measure, and don't feel like you should do any particular thing. Just try stuff and see whether it works. Remember that minimum viable product idea.
So, as you may be aware, the scholarly publishing community is currently talking a whole lot about various different licensing schemes for their content. And I was wondering if you had any perspective, given what's going on in open source, about how licensing can promote or inhibit innovation, especially this kind of low-impact, flexible experimenting.
I have to say, I've always been somebody who thought that the focus in discussions of open source software around licenses was fairly counterproductive. And the more open licenses, to me, have been more successful than the ones that try to control what people can and can't do. For example, the GPL, which is very sort of moralistic and says you have to do this, you have to do that, versus the Apache or for that matter, the web, which was put into the public domain. But again, it depends what your goals are. You know, at O'Reilly, we still copyright our content, and we ask people to pay us. And we don't give it all away, but we also assume that people want us to stay in business and that they will pay us. And so far, we've been right. So I guess I would say the exact license is probably less important than that it be available in that things be available in machine readable form, that you think about what the customer really wants. We wrote actually some. This has been back around 2007. We had a kind of a workshop on open government data, and we wrote like 8 principles of open data for that. If you Google for that, you'll actually find, I think some really interesting thinking there. Actually, it was great. Larry Lessig was our scribe. Sorry, but it was the work of a group of about 30 people. Don't get caught in the agonizing over licenses. I love Shakespeare. The hot blood leaps over the cold decree. Most people will never read the license anyway.
Hi, I'm Heather Staines from a company called Sipix. We're a Stanford startup, and we're closing the loop on licensing intellectual property. I'd like to give a shout out to those machine-readable licenses because that would make our lives easier. I have a 10-year-old and 12-year-old, both boys, and we have a lot of Minecraft going on in our house. We've got a lot of Xbox Live. I've got virtual children, in my basement at any time. I have to watch what I say. But I'm interested in how the interaction between that online gaming could be connected with a technology like glass and the increasing overlap between the physical world and the virtual world, and particularly selling virtual goods. If people can convince, how to buy clothes for your avatar, we ought to be able to think of a way to sell them our content in a virtual and overlapping into the physical environment. I just wondered if you thought at all about that intersection.
Yeah, I haven't really. I do think it's a good observation. I will say that even though I know that it's effective, there's a lot of so-called gamification that I just find myself not that fond of, even though it works, because I don't want to sell people things that they don't want. It's actually a great effort I've become a little involved with recently with a guy from Google who this actually apparently got some Google management interested in this, which is they're really thinking a lot about the psychology of regret. And they think online there are a lot of people who are doing things that they later regret, and we built a whole science around getting people to do things that they later regret. And he's trying to get people to start thinking about how do we stop doing that as an industry. Mm-hmm. So I'm less interested in selling people virtual academic products that they don't want, and more thinking about how do we build better products that people really do want, that they'll say, oh my gosh, I didn't realize how badly I needed that. This is Don, you can. While you're heading up there, I'm going to bring up one other thing, which is I left this out of my deck, but I just want to share this. We have this event called Maker Faire, and it's I think we just had something like 120,000 people show up at the Maker Faire in San Mateo. It's about robotics and sensors and sort of a family event. It's kind of like, think about it as a county fair with robots. And it's got me thinking a lot about how much play is, a part of what motivates people. The theme of the magazine, we recently spun Maker Media into a separate company, but Dale Doherty, who started, his original caption for the magazine, Make Magazine, which preceded the fair, was technology on your own time. Why am I telling you this? I think that scholarship is play. I remember my original background is in classics, and I actually still, when I spend a lot of time in Washington, D.C., and I stay at the Harvard Center for Hellenic Studies, and with some of my old friends from the field. And I was reading this one paper by a friend of mine. It was like images of bees in Homer. I thought, why does somebody go write a paper like that? And I thought, it's exactly the same as people going to Maker Faire, you know, and building the latest cool robot. They are playing with their minds, you know, and I think that would be something that I would kind of urge you all to leaven your, you know, angst with, which is to remember how much fun it is to learn and to study and to spread what you've learned and what you know, and to make that part of your mission, you know, as a scholarly publisher. All right, Don?
I have to ask you a question you've probably been asked at least a million times. I noticed on your slide you had TOC.
Yeah.
Why did you stop it? Are you thinking of going in some other different direction? Could you give us the benefit of some of your thinking on that?
Yeah, you know, it was sort of a tough call, but the bottom line was New York is an incredibly expensive place to run a conference. You know, we've never made any money on the event. You know, we often do things for strategic reasons. You know, when we started you know, doing the TOC conference, Tools of Change for Publishing, it was like, hey, we had been working to get publishers to pay attention to ebooks, to start thinking about them. And, you know, we kind of looked at it and we said, okay, everybody's all over ebooks at this point. Why are we still doing this? We're not making money at it. It's sort of a labor of love, but, you know, we should move on to something else that we, yeah, because we're making strategic choices about what we can and should invest in. And it just didn't seem like, you know, even though it was interesting, it was, you know, didn't any longer make the cut as something that we needed to do. Now, I would have liked to see it, you know, there may have been some execution issues. I mean, I still like to think that if we'd done it a little differently, maybe we could have made it a more successful event. And you may yet see another publishing event from us. I'm not saying that you wouldn't, but it might have a different focus.
Hi, David Smith from Cabby. One of the things that strikes me, you called out in your talk about PageRank, which I think the original paper was published, so we can see the algorithm for PageRank. But of course, now Google gives us information, especially with something like Google Now, using an entirely proprietary set of algorithms with many hundreds of variables that none of us here even really know about. And my question is, when you're talking about deriving value and signals from connections, from analyzing data, how can we get a sense of an understanding of the underlying logic that delivers that piece of information? I mean, I'm using Google Now, having come from the UK to San Francisco, and I'm finding it impressive. Yet I'm aware that in some respects what I'm seeing is a purely Google representation of what it thinks is relevant and potentially valuable to me. And I find, as someone in the scholarly arena, I'm somewhat uncomfortable about that whilst being impressed with it at the same time.
Yeah, you know, I will say this about it. I think it's absolutely true. But I think that's true of all intellectual activity. You know, I mean, the fact is, you know, if you, you know, grew up in this country, you read a slice of history. You know, I remember going with my, you know, my mother on a day trip to Tallinn. We were at a MySQL board meeting in Finland. We went over to Tallinn in Estonia, and the history, you know, in the museum, it was so different. It was all about their battles with Sweden, stuff that was not even a footnote in my history books. You know, so I mean, I think we're over angsting about the fact that we're getting, you know, somebody's view of the world. I mean, come on. I mean, we had the New York Times view of the world, or the Wall Street Journal's view of the world is so different. But I still agree with you that it is a really important issue to think about. John Madison, who's the Chief Medical Information Officer at Kaiser, at our Strata RX conference on healthcare, said something really, really interesting to me, which is, he said, the biggest question of the next decade is going to be, whose black box do you trust?
Right, and here's the thing, because if you're dealing in science, right, the best representation of reality as objectively tested wins. Okay?
Is that so?
Yeah. It's absolutely so, right? Okay? We probably don't particularly understand gravity particularly well, but we all understand what's going to happen if we go to the top of this hotel and jump off, right? So I appreciate that you can have a vigorous debate in fields that are emerging, but sooner or later science progresses
I
by
understand,
the
but I mean,
establishment of fact.
You know, when
As
Google told me the
verifiable.
best way to get here from my office, you know, I think it was demonstrably the best way to get here. I mean, I would just say in science, I would bet that there are a whole lot of models that very, very few people understand that explain things. You know, I guess all I'm saying is access to the models and the number of people who understand the models isn't really a criterion. We live in a world of black boxes. We always have. And, you know, I hear you that, you know, there's a real concern that as more and more of the black boxes are really black and, you know, dark, you know, it's not as good a world in which everybody understands the rules. And that's, of course, where we have this sort of crazy intellectual property regime that encourages rather than, you know, to promote the, you know, science and the useful arts, instead actually holds them back. I buy that. But I wouldn't single out somebody like Google for special scorn. I think that, you know, ultimately, you know, there's a lot of trade secrets throughout our culture, and you know, I would venture that you know, any device you use, any machine, you know, there's a lot of hidden knowledge that somebody does not share. And actually, there's even apart from that, there's how many people here have read that wonderful paper called iPencil? It's written in the 50s. It's basically it's a 20-page biography of a pencil, and it opens with this sort of wonderful premise that you know, I am such a simple object, and yet there is not one of you who knows how to make me, you know, because there's so many different, you know, pieces that go into its manufacture. All right, I think we're done with questions, and that's that. And I hope you really, really enjoy this conference. Thank you.